To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
In 2011, fictional romance author Nancy Brophy wrote a book called How to Murder Your Husband. She seemed to have a knack for writing about these things, murder and criminal investigations. But 7 years later, in 2022, she found herself being accused of the very things she wrote about in her novels. Prosecutors put her on trial for killing her husband of over 25 years. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 246, The Nancy Brophy Story, Part 1. Nancy Lee Crampton was born the middle child in Wichita Falls, Texas on June 16, 1950, a city 150 miles northwest of Dallas. Almost everyone in her family was a lawyer, starting with her parents, Roger and Barbara, who were partners at the same firm. She also came from a family of trailblazers. Her mom, Barbara, was only the third woman ever to practice law in the city. Growing up, Nancy made a name for herself practically everywhere she went. She graduated with honors from Wichita Falls High School in 1968. And after high school, she studied economics at the University of Houston. It was during college that she began writing. But writing wasn't the only thing she was known for around the college campus. She also became popular by becoming a student activist promoting women's health to anyone and everyone who would listen to her. Something that really wasn't being openly talked about in the 1970s. She founded a group called the Population Awareness Committee and passed out condoms on campus while persuading the university administrators to provide free birth control services at the student clinic. Later on, the dean of students credited her with being one of the students who convinced them to hire the university's first gynecologist for female students. But passing out condoms around campus wasn't the only thing she did to promote student health. Nancy's first book publication as a writer was called Between Your Navel and Your Knees. It was supposed to be just a capstone project for one of her 400-level sociology classes, but it turned out to be so much more than that. It was a student-focused health pamphlet that talked about everything from birth control pills, IUDs, and vasectomies to ineffective birth control techniques grouped under the heading, Surefire Ways to Get Pregnant. No one at the university had seen anything like it. It was both educational and funny. The whole thing was different and unique, and it talked about important health issues in a way that only college kids would either understand or appreciate. So after receiving copies of it, the university's student governing body decided to allocate over $1,600 toward printing the 44-page booklet. And about 3 weeks later, all 8,000 copies were gone, leading to a second printing. The release got so much attention that it even triggered an investigation from a Texas state lawmaker who accused the then 22-year-old Nancy of promoting abortion. At the time, abortion was illegal in Texas. So when lawmakers heard that Nancy was telling students that they could reach out to their local Planned Parenthood and schedule to have one done in a different state like California or New York, they tried getting in her way. Pregnancy is like dying. It's not real to most girls, she told a Houston Post reporter in March 1972, a few months after her college graduation. Most college students just don't believe it will happen to them. She also did interviews for local newspapers, Women's Day magazines, and a few television shows. Although much of its information is probably outdated today, the original copy is still available at the University of Houston Student Library. It featured the same type of satirical humor she would use in some of her novels many years later. After graduating from college, she worked in real estate and moved back to her hometown, where she met and married a police officer named Joe. She met him through her mom, who was a criminal defense attorney, and Joe worked for her as an investigator. They were both young and quickly fell in love, eloping just 6 months after meeting. However, the relationship didn't last. The two eventually split up and went their separate ways after Joe moved away for graduate school and they couldn't make the long-distance relationship work. Looking for a fresh start, then 40-year-old Nancy decided to pack her bags and move from Texas to Oregon in 1990. When she got there, she decided it was also time to switch careers. So she enrolled at what used to be called the Western Culinary Institute, but now goes by Le Cordon Bleu College of Culinary Arts in Portland. She now had her mind set on becoming a chef. That's where she met Daniel Brophy. She was a new student at the school, and he was a first-year instructor who went by Dan. Like Nancy, Dan had previously been married and had a son. However, the marriage fell apart and they divorced in 1994. Following the divorce, Dan and his son became somewhat estranged, and it wasn't until many years later that he came back around. Although Dan was the instructor and Nancy was the student, she was almost exactly 4 years older. Dan was born on June 27, 1954, and Nancy was born 4 years and 9 days earlier on June 16, 1950. At first, they were just casual friends, a new culinary student and a first-year instructor at the school. But somewhere along the way, they became more than friends and started dating, even though they were complete opposites. He was quiet, reserved, and a homebody, and she couldn't be more different. She was very outgoing, active, and loud. But still, there was something that just drew them together. Later on, Nancy told her friends that one of the first things that stood out about him was his intelligence. When Dan wasn't teaching culinary classes, he read books about marine biology or composting. Besides being an accomplished chef, he also had a degree in marine biology. All of his friends described him as a no-waste kind of guy. He was so passionate about not letting anything go to waste that he made sure the culinary school's extra food went to the homeless people in the area. His friends also said that he was a beekeeper, master gardener, expert at foraging and cooking edible mushrooms, and always on the lookout for the latest cooking trends. 8 years after first meeting, they tied the knot in 1999 by putting on a large wedding ceremony in front of all their family and friends. Then, as a married couple, they bought a large 4-bedroom house together in the suburbs. From that moment, they were supposed to live happily ever after. But just like most marriages, they had their own set of challenges over the years. One of them being money. Dan continued to work as a culinary instructor, earning between $50,000 and $60,000 a year. And Nancy spent 10 years running a catering business in Northwest Portland, which turned out to be very successful, at least initially. According to their 1999 tax return documents, the business earned around $500,000 the previous year. But it took a dramatic turn in 2001. Instead of making almost $500,000, it started laying off some of its employees. In fact, by September of 2001, the business had gone from 25 full-time employees to only 15. Not long after that, she sold the company in the early 2000s. Outside of the catering and culinary world, Nancy kept up with her writing hobby. Of course, she had that college health booklet published, but that was years ago. She was now onto writing complete fictional novels. At first, she didn't do it to try to make any money. It was just something that she really enjoyed doing. She wrote for trade journals and human resource departments. But her true love at the end of the day was storytelling. By 2003, she joined her local chapter of Romance Writers of America. That's when she started writing a lot more and taking it seriously. This is what her Amazon author's profile says about her style. Quote, "Her stories are about pretty men and strong women, about families that don't always work, and about the joy of finding love and the difficulty of making it stay." End quote. From titles like The Wrong Lover and The Wrong Husband, most of her books talked about things like cheating spouses or star-crossed lovers, while others dove into the deep world of police procedure, sometimes mixing all three of these. While Nancy may have enjoyed writing these fictional romance novels, they weren't exactly paying the bills. Even though she would eventually publish 9 romance novels, she only made a little money doing it. Yes, she did have some book sales coming in over the years, but at the end of the day, it wasn't nearly enough to make ends meet. They still relied on Dan's teacher salary to try and keep up with the mortgage payments on the house. And even then, that didn't seem to be enough. Month over month, they were spending a lot more than they were making. At one point, their finances were so bad that Dan had to go out and get a second job on the weekend while he still taught Monday through Friday at the culinary school. And Nancy started selling insurance plans to family and friends as a side hustle. One of the books Nancy published during her writing career was called How to Murder Your Husband, a title that, of course, would eventually come back and haunt her. The book was supposed to be a satire, using humor to talk about one of the worst things that you could do as a wife, kill your very own husband. In it, she talks about all sorts of ways that someone could do it or why. When it comes to motive, she says there can be a lot of different reasons. Financial, a lying or cheating husband, you fall in love with someone else, or maybe your husband is an abuser. But divorce is really expensive and says, who wants to divide up all your assets anyway? She warns you that if you actually go through with it and you do it, the police are probably going to look at you as the wife as the first possible suspect. It's always the significant other. The book lists out all the different ways that you can do it. Using guns, but she says those are loud and messy. Here's a direct quote about that from the book. If it takes 10 shots for the sucker to die, either you have terrible aim or he's on drugs. Knives, but that's super close up and personal. Also messy because blood goes everywhere. A garrote, which I think is a weapon that most people only associate with the murder of John Benet Ramsey. Poison. She writes how easy it is to get arsenic, but how long it can take to finally work, sometimes a month or 2. Plus, she says how they're really sick all the time that you start poisoning them, and who wants to hang out with a sick husband who you also want dead? A random heavy piece of equipment. She says you can also hire a hitman, but who personally knows one or who has a hitman on speed dial that they can just pick up the phone and call to out their husband? You might also hire a lover to come and do it. But she says that's never a good idea either. The husband dies and the wife gets the money. But what about her lover? He doesn't always win in that scenario. So you might have to turn around and kill him too. And that's just too much work. Who wants to do that? The book goes on and on about different ways to do it and what the pros and cons are to each one. It's supposed to be witty and funny. But in the end, Nancy has one very important message for her readers. Murdering your husband is only worth doing if you won't get caught. It seems like she should have listened to her own advice, because 7 years after publishing that book, she was arrested for her husband's murder after being together for 25 years. On June 2nd, 2018, students at the now closed Oregon Culinary Institute arrived on campus to start their day of classes. But instead of walking into the classroom and seeing their instructor, 63-year-old Dan Brophy, standing at the door to welcome them, they found him lying on the kitchen floor, dead. When the police first arrived, they thought he must have had a heart attack, so they started performing CPR. It wasn't until they saw the blood on their hands that they realized this was definitely no heart attack. He had been shot twice. Word about a beloved culinary instructor being shot dead inside of his very own classroom immediately hit the media. And within minutes, news vans were popping up all around campus, wanting to get the full story. The only thing keeping them out was the crime scene tape that covered a 3-block radius around the campus. Right from the very beginning, Dan's death was treated and investigated as a homicide. So the first thing Oregon detectives needed to do was notify Nancy about what had happened. She was the wife, after all. So they called her and asked her to come down to the culinary school. Now in her late 60s, officers told Nancy that her husband was found shot to death inside his classroom. The first question they had for her was that, do you know anyone who might have want him dead? But she said absolutely not. She couldn't think of a single person. Dan was someone that virtually everyone liked. The second question they asked were about her whereabouts that morning. At first, the police had no real reason to suspect that she was involved, but it was simple police procedure. They needed to rule out the spouse, and the best way to do that is to find out their alibi. Nancy initially told investigators that she had been at home in bed writing all morning and didn't know what happened until they called to tell her. However, I want to mention here that some news reports online say that she told the police that she was out walking her dogs and took a shower that morning. Either way, whether she was in bed all day writing, out walking the dogs, taking a shower, or even doing a combination of all three, Nancy completely denied ever going to the culinary school that morning. She said she was nowhere near it, an important detail that we'll talk about in just a minute. The detectives went on questioning her, trying to get as many clues as they could. And one of the last questions they asked was, does Dan own a gun? No gun was found at the scene, but they thought it was a question worth asking. Nancy told detectives that yes, she and her husband decided to buy a gun at a gun show earlier that year in February after the Parkland High School school shooting in Florida. She said the shooting really scared them, so they thought it was a good idea to go out and buy a gun just to have as some type of protection. But she said when they brought the gun home, they sort of changed their minds about it. They didn't like the idea of having the gun inside the house, and they sort of rushed to their decision to buy it in the first place. She said they didn't return it, but they never put any bullets in it. So it basically just sat in the house unused and untouched. So she told the police she had no reason to believe that Dan would have taken it out of the house or had it on him that morning. Once the detectives wrapped up their questioning, they escorted her back home. One, they wanted to make sure that she got back okay. And number two, they wanted to check to see if the gun was still at the house. But here's where the police made a big mistake. They never tested Nancy's hands for gunshot residue, probably because she wasn't considered a suspect yet. So if she fired a gun that morning, we'll never know it because no GSR test was ever done. By nighttime, everyone in town knew about Dan's murder. All of his friends, fellow faculty members at the culinary school, family, everyone. But no one knew why. Who would murder someone like Dan Brophy? Detectives started their investigation by going through all of his devices, like his cell phone and his tablet. Sometimes, those are key pieces of evidence to finding out what someone was up to in the moments right before their death. And that's when they found something interesting on his tablet. A web search for an article called 10 Ways to Cover Up a Murder. But why would he be the one to search for that? Wasn't he the one that was found murdered? The school where Dan worked had no working surveillance cameras in any of the classrooms. So the only evidence they found at the crime scene. They knew he got to school at 7:22 because that's when the alarm was deactivated. He was also wearing his school-issued chef uniform pants and a jacket over a t-shirt. An autopsy would later reveal that he had been shot twice with a Glock 9mm, once in the back and then in the chest, at close range, while he was lying on the floor of a kitchen. He had no signs of any defensive wounds like he tried to fight back. There were also no signs of a struggle anywhere in the classroom. No turned over desks or chairs, no broken glass, everything was neat and clean. 2 shell casings were found at the scene, but investigators couldn't find any fingerprints on them. They only knew that they came from a Glock 9mm. Another clue they had was the kitchen sink. The water was still running when students got there, as if someone had caught Dan by surprise while he was getting water. So with this information, the police came up with a theory. Dan drank iced coffee every morning. So he was probably getting the ice water and coffee ready before his students were supposed to be there. The shooter probably walked up behind him and shot him in the back. He didn't see them coming, so he had no time to fight back, which explains why there weren't any defensive wounds. And nothing else was out of place, suggesting either a struggle or a fight. Then the shooter finished him off with a second shot to the chest. They wanted to make sure that he would never walk away from this. The whole thing could have been over within seconds. Another odd thing about this scene was that all of Dan's possessions were still with him. His wallet had $70 in cash in it. His credit cards and his ID were still in his wallet. His iPhone was in his pocket. So robbery obviously wasn't the motive, which meant to the police that this had to be over something personal. Investigators sat down and questioned all of the students in Dan's class so that each one of them could be ruled out. The theory was maybe one of them got a bad grade and took out their revenge on him. But none of these interviews with students panned out. Sure, Dan probably had a couple students who didn't like him, but that didn't really mean anything. Just because you don't like your teacher, you don't go grab a gun and shoot him. So that's when detectives turned to another possible theory: homeless people. At the time, there were a lot of homeless people living around the area of the school. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier that Dan had created an outreach program that gave the schools extra food to the homeless people. Well, that gave rise to the second theory. Maybe one of these homeless people attacked him as he was getting the classroom set up for the day. But just like the angry student theory, the police didn't find any evidence of that either. If he was attacked by someone, they didn't take anything from him. Remember, he still had his cell phone, his wallet, his money, everything. And let's not forget, Dan was probably the last person they wanted to harm. He was the one making sure that they got food. So it just didn't make any sense. Going back to the security cameras, investigators knew that the school didn't have any working cameras. But what about the neighborhoods surrounding the school? Most businesses, whether it's a store or a restaurant, have some type of security system. Well, as it turned out, the pizza place right across the street did have a working camera. So as soon as they found out about that, the police went over there wanting to view the tape. They knew Dan was killed a few minutes after 7:30 that morning because that's when the students got there. They also know that he arrived at 7:22 because that's when the alarm system was deactivated. So there was only about a 10 to 15 minute time frame in which the murder could have taken place. And with a short time frame like that, the shooter probably stalked Dan and knew exactly when he got there. They would have had to have known that and basically followed him inside, shot and killed him, and then got out of there before any of the students arrived. So the police focused their search of the tapes around that same time. The video from the pizza place was a little bit grainy, but they could still make out most of what was happening. At first, the video just showed random cars driving down the street, nothing really out of the ordinary. But then detectives saw a car that caught their attention. The same older model silver minivan Dan's wife Nancy drove. It drove up to the school at 6:39 and was spotted again at 7:08, just minutes before Dan arrived in his white pickup truck. This discovery immediately raised red flags for detectives because Nancy had told them earlier that she had been at home all morning. She never said she went to the culinary school. But now, a silver minivan that looked exactly like hers was seen pulling up to the school right before they believed Dan was shot and killed, and then again seconds after. So was she lying about where she was when her husband was murdered? Well, at first nobody knew. It looked like Nancy's silver minivan, but because the video was so grainy, they couldn't read the license plate or get a good look at the driver. So yes, it was suspicious, but it definitely wasn't enough to say that she was driving. But not long after the pizza place video, more red flags popped up that continued to point the police in Nancy's direction. Right after Dan's death, Nancy tried selling their house. We're talking within just a few hours of his death, she was calling real estate agents. She told a friend that she was on the deed for the house, but her name wasn't listed on the mortgage. So this meant the bank could come in and run a credit report to see if she could make the mortgage payments on her own without Dan. If she couldn't, then they could foreclose on the house. Dan was the only one with a stable job at the culinary school, and Nancy only really had her book sales that weren't very consistent. She also had a small income coming in from the insurance sales that she did as a side hustle, but that was pretty much it. There was no way that she could afford the mortgage payment on the house on her own without Dan. So Nancy told friends that was the reason that she wanted to sell the house so quickly. But detectives wondered if she had other motives. At the same time Nancy was getting ready to put the house up on the market, the police were busy themselves trying to answer one question. Was Nancy Brophy a grieving widow? Or did she have something to do with her husband's murder? They already had video footage showing that she might have lied about where she was that morning, and now she was trying to put the house up for sale as quickly as possible. But besides that, the police had something else up their sleeves that made them suspicious of her. The gun that she said she and Dan purchased back in February. They knew it was a Glock 17 9mm, the same type of gun that they believed was used to shoot and kill Dan. But they needed to find out if that was the exact gun used or not. However, testing on the weapon took not just weeks, but months. So in the meantime, detectives had other leads to follow up on, but all seemed to turn into yet another dead end. The same road that kept leading them back to Nancy. Investigators decided to go back to the drawing board and look for more security footage of that silver minivan from different businesses in the area. And from those videos, the police began to piece together the van's movements that morning. A camera at a Max light rail station showed the van arriving at the culinary school from the direction of Nancy's house about an hour before Dan got to school that morning. Then it went down Jefferson near a BMW car dealership and then turned on one of the streets to the south, which detectives thought was a little bit strange because it was a dead-end street. After that, it pulled back out and drove into the street, stopping at a red light. From that angle, they got a clear view of the minivan's driver, a woman who looked exactly like Nancy, with no one else inside. That's when the minivan began driving around the school again. It circled the area a few times before disappearing for a while. Then it showed back up at the top of the hill on Jefferson Street. From that position, whoever was driving could look straight down Jefferson Street to see Southwest 17th Avenue, the cross street that went right into Oregon Culinary Institute. So if that really were Nancy behind the wheel, she would have had a bird's eye view of exactly when Dan showed up to work that morning. 15 minutes after the murder, the van drove away in the direction back to Nancy and Dan's house. Once again, the police had all the video footage analyzed. But this time, things were different. Because this time around, they were able to make out the first 3 letters of the van's license plate. And the numbers matched Nancy's minivan perfectly. They could even see the same church sticker on the back window, the same one that Nancy had on hers. The video evidence was certainly compelling enough to suggest that Nancy was at the school when her husband was murdered, but it still wasn't enough for an arrest. 3 months later, in early September, the forensic lab results on Nancy and Dan's gun finally came back. But the results were disappointing. The ballistics didn't match up. It didn't look like that was the gun used in the murder. Even with that disappointing news, investigators weren't giving up. They still considered Nancy their prime suspect, even if the ballistics weren't matching. She might have looked like this old, sweet lady with gray hair and a matching cardigan, but they knew she lied about where she was that morning. And the mountain of evidence against her was only getting bigger. At this point in the investigation, detectives had enough suspicion to search the inside of Nancy and Dan's home, and that's where they found a treasure trove of information. The first thing they uncovered was that their iTunes accounts were linked, so any article bookmarked on one device was accessible on another. Well, remember when I said that investigators found a search on Dan's device for 10 Ways to Cover Up a Murder. Well, it wasn't actually Dan who looked up that article. It was Nancy. But because their accounts were linked, it showed up on his tablet like he was the one that searched it. They also found 2 laptops inside the house, one in a closet and another one on Nancy's bed. The one on the bed was interesting because right next to it, the police found some random insurance papers. At first, this made sense. They knew Nancy was selling insurance to family members and friends as a side hustle to make a little extra money. So maybe that's what it was for. But when they started reading the documents a little closer, they discovered that one of the letters was addressed to Dan. It was written by Nancy and talked about an upcoming surgery that she had planned, although the letter was several years old and the surgery that she was talking about also happened years ago. She wrote about how she wanted Dan to know that if she died during this operation, she had very specific instructions for him to follow. She said, open Chrome on her laptop, the target with the blue center and the multicolored circle. Type in Facebook and her account should come up automatically. After that, she wanted him to write up a brief statement about her death. She went on telling him how he could sell the house, spend the insurance money, and fix the backyard. Quote, if you decide not to sell the house, consider a roommate to offset the costs. I understand you think you can live in a tiny house, but you like stuff way too much to make that work. End quote. After that, she included who to contact for the mortgage and who to contact for the real estate agent. Then it talked about all the different life insurance policies that she had under her name. She had thought of everything. She even left detailed instructions on publishing the final book in her romantic suspense series. At face value, this just looked like a loving letter. A wife telling her husband exactly what to do in case she died, and she wanted to make sure that he would be okay. But something about the letter just didn't sit right with detectives. For starters, the letter was just lying out there in the open next to her laptop when this surgery, this procedure that she was talking about, happened years earlier. So why did she bring it out now? And second, she knew the police were considering her as a possible suspect in the murder. So did she have it out because if she didn't die in the surgery, then she was planning on him being dead instead? The police wondered if those instructions were actually now for her to collect on the insurance policies and be able to profit after Dan's death. Early on in the investigation, Nancy told detectives that she and Dan only had about $40,000 in life insurance policies. So this made it seem like neither one of them really had much to gain financially if either one of them suddenly died. But the police knew enough to suspect that the couple had been struggling with money for years. Nancy had to sell the catering business, she wasn't making much from the book sales, and at one point, Dan went out and got a second job. So detectives decided to dig even deeper into their finances to see if that could be a possible motive for murder. And this is what they found. Nancy might have said that they only had about $40,000 in life insurance policies, but that turned out to be a lie. Paper trails showed that they had closer to $850,000 in policies, and the vast majority of them were on Dan's life, not Nancy's. Even more digging revealed that Nancy was spending around $1,000 a month to pay for these policies. That's a lot of money for anyone to spend on life insurance, especially someone struggling financially as much as she was at the time. They could barely afford to make their mortgage payment each month, let alone fork over $1,000 to pay for life insurance. It's like robbing Peter to pay Paul. So if Dan died, Nancy would stand to gain everything. She could sell the house, cash in on all the life insurance policies, and then live out the rest of her life comfortably. But for that to happen, Dan had to be dead. This is the end of part 1 of the Nancy Brophy story. Tune in next week to listen to part 2 and the end of the story. To listen early and ad-free, consider joining our Patreon at patreon.com/forensictales. To share your thoughts on this week's episode, follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. To find out what I think about the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode sharing my personal thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you don't miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, consider leaving us a positive review. You can also help support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Please join me next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell Areola. For a small monthly contribution, you can help create new compelling cases for the show, help fund research, and assist with production and editing costs. For supporting the show, you'll become one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. Thank you so much for this week's newest supporters on Patreon, Izzy and Diane H. To learn more, please visit patreon.com/forensictales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers, Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Jerry M., Brian W., Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Ken S., Carol A., Luis B., Marianne C., and Lynn H. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page, or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.